This week we talk about information gathering and elicitation. Information gathering is one of the cruxes for social engineering. It's getting all of the data that we need to be able to make an informed social engineering attack. And what does that mean? It's finding out about the person, it's finding out about the organization, it's finding out about any kind of press related to that organization or person. So the first thing is, how can I go about gathering this information? What are the sources and what are the methods that I can use? What sources are available? So we know that there are some sources simply from going online. We know that we can get information from social media. We know we can get information from websites. We know that we can get information simply by going on sites that check whether you have been breached or not. There's many different sites within the internet to start with to start to gather this information. And once you start to gather the information, the best part of it is you can start to build a profile. So for example, if you wanted to do a social engineering attack, let's say on the president of Marymount, Dr. Matthew Shanks, President Shank. The first thing you would do is you would go to all of the Marymount sites and you would start looking about things that he's been involved with at Marymount, most likely. Then you might look at his LinkedIn account. And then you might try to see other universities where he's worked at when you find them out and see what they say about him. And then you might want to do this, whether he's been hacked. So there's all types of information that you can start gathering, the white pages to find out where he lives, just to start to put this profile together of who is this guy that runs the university. And then the next thing is you start to gather all this information. You might gather some of it through data. You might actually gather some physical pieces of evidence that you've picked up through some method that we'll talk about later. But you need to somehow store it in a way that you can easily get at it. So gathering information from websites. So this is a pretty interesting one. Like, this was a group, and this group is actually a group that does penetration testing. And you look at the website and the things that you could find from this website. What do they do? So there's a about. You can go to the about, the products they sell. Here's the services they talk about. The locations. If you go to about, it'll tell you the different locations and the contact us. There's job openings with careers. The contact numbers are there. The biographies of the people involved are within that, as well as the board of directors. Forums. Okay, so you can see resources here. Naming conventions. There might be some information about how they do some of their work and how they categorize it, and special words or phrases that might be on this. And gathering this information from this website, you start to get a profile of who that group is. The reason that's important for social engineering is the more information you have before beginning any kind of social engineering attack, whether you're doing it as a white hat hacker or a black hackers, and we don't have any of those in this class, but you need to have information in order to have legitimacy. So social engineering sources. So we sort of talked about it. Search engines. Google is not the only search engine, by the way. There are multiple other search engines that you can use. I mean, obviously there's Yahoo and there's other different types that you might know. But really, within specific career areas, if you go to the library, for example, and you do research for articles on a topic, like maybe it's going to be on penetration testing, all you have to do is go to those search engines and you can get information. So don't limit yourself to Google. Remember, Google is becoming a big advertiser. So unless you're paying money, you're gonna have to crawl through a lot of papers. And remember, there's the Google web, there's the deep web, and then there's the dark web. Now, I'm not suggesting at all you go to the dark web, although I have a friend who's a patent officer, and one of the things that they have to do when finding information about products that are requesting a new patent is actually to go to the dark web to do searches there to see if that particular product has some information about it in that space as well. So doing social engineering requires utilizing search engines, social media. looking at different blogs, looking at public reports. You can just go online. You can find out about my property taxes, for example. You can find out about the cars that I own online just by going to the government sites. So that's another place. Going through people's garbage. So he tells a very interesting story, Chris Hagney, in his book about doing a social engineering where he rents a car, and in the car, the people before him, the car place did not take the bag of trash out of the car. So he goes into this bag of trash, and just out of curiosity, he sees that there's like some kind of a CVS receipt. And then he also sees that there is a check that's cut. And the check that's ripped up is only ripped up into 4 pieces. So from that check, he's able to get the guy's name, his bank account, who he was writing the check to, his address. So he goes and he does information. He's able to determine the guy's balance in his bank account and some other information just through combing the trash. So being very careful about trash. And one of the big things that when you're buying a shredder is that the cross shredding is most important, because if you just do a linear, you could theoretically piece it together. You got to be pretty important for people to do that for you. But anyhow, that's another method of finding information. And then lastly, observation. Just watching people, watching their behaviors, noticing that every morning. For example, I notice my neighbors that every morning at 7 o'clock, they walk to the bus. And then at around 4:30, I notice that they're coming back. So I sort of have observed that they leave for work around 7. They don't return until 4:30. So that means that their house is pretty much vacant. They take the bus. So that means they have to adhere to bus schedules, etc. So just observing people and their behaviors is another way to gather information. And that's what we're doing. So as the social engineer, your goal is to collect data, information about the target, whether the target is the company or whether the target is a specific person. The more effective the data is that you gather, whether you find out information about their family, whether you find information about where they work, their hobbies, the more information you have, the more effective a social engineering attack is going to be. So, for example, if you're going to do a phishing attack on somebody, and you're going to do it on not the CFO, but you're going to do it on the person that works for the CFO. Maybe it's going to be the controller. And you're going to say in the social engineering attack, hey, Brad, you're going to spoof an email from Brad, the CFO, and you're going to send it to Mike. And you're going to say, Mike, who is the controller, you're going to say, Mike, I'm going to be leaving on my trip to China. Can you please wire me money ahead of time so that I can get currency when I'm in China? This is the account to wire the money to. See you in a week, Brad. All right. So now it looks authentic. The email has been spoofed, so it looks like it's Brad's email, the CFO. It's got all this personal information. It's very friendly. There's a good chance Mike's going to wire money to that account. Unless there's some policies and procedures. But the point is, as you are able to craft and individualize these phishing attempts, you're not going for the low-level people. You're going for people who actually have access to money and power. So, communication methods. So one of the things that we can do is, when we communicate, because the whole process of getting information is in a social sense is actually communicating with people, asking them questions and having them get questions back. So there's different types of communication, and this is very obvious, but I want to point it out to you. So there's the verbal communication of what people say, and then there's the facial and nonverbal communication of how do they really feel about it. Because nonverbal communication requires a conscious effort to suppress our subconscious feelings about a topic. So nonverbal, our facial expressions where somebody might say, they might be in agreement, but, their face is like, not really, or the one at the very left on the bottom, I think, is the perfect example of somebody who appears to look like They're agreeing to make you happy, but they're not really. They look skeptical. Look at those eyebrows. So understanding both the verbal, what people say, and the nonverbal, what it means, and matching those communication methods is very important to be able to discern the legitimacy of a message. And in this class, we really have to get into the psyche of people because we are really building relationships with people to get information. This is the biggest way that we're able to do it. In my 355 class, they had to identify different kinds of hacking experiences that have occurred, breaches that have occurred in the last 18 months. And almost every single one of them, it wasn't that it was a DDoS attack. It was that somebody, a human, did something that caused the breach. And there's all these different motivations that occur. So one of the stories that he talks about in communicating was that he goes to an event. It's like a Toastmaster type of event where the big CFO for a company is there that he knew he wanted to meet. He meets the CFO. He talks with the guy just in conversation. He finds out that the guy is going to be going on vacation. He then gets some other information about the company enough. He then goes when the guy's on vacation, and he says he comes to the place and says, "I met Joe at this event." And then the administrative person says, "Oh, well, Joe's not here." And he says, "Oh, that's too bad. I really was supposed to leave him something. I'm wondering if I can then leave it with his administrative assistant." So the person at the front says, "Sure." Chris Hagney, the social engineer, goes, and what he does is go into one of the restrooms. He leaves a USB there. Guess what? A non-suspecting person gets the USB. They're curious. They take the USB, and bingo, they plug it into their computer, which then has the potential to infect the entire network. So the unsuspecting person probably thought they were helping. Like, oh, let's see, maybe this identifies who this USB is. Or it might be curiosity. Geez, I wonder what's on this USB. But in any event, it was a human action that caused such an event. Now, there really wasn't a hacking of that network for this specific example. But what it brings to light is how the humans really play a huge role in this process. So there's several assumptions when you're communicating that we need to really keep in mind. My reality isn't the same as your reality. So don't think that people see things the same way that I do. And don't assume that they understand the message the same way you intended it. And, we all have been in relationships, and we know that we might say something, but our other person that we're speaking to interprets it totally different. And that's dependent upon A, how we said it, B, the wording we used, but C, the mood of the other person and what that other person was thinking at the time. So communication is never a finite event. It's something that occurs over and over again. And the problem with communication is it can occur over and over in somebody's head, and they can be distorting it along the way. So you have to assume that there are as many realities as there are people. And how somebody interprets something at one point in time may not be the same way they interpreted it another point in time. So the reasons that's important is because time and space really dictate, when creating a social engineering attack, how effective it's going to be. So the communication method here, is circular, shall we say. It starts with there is some source that we want to go after. There's a target, and there's a method we're going to use, and there's a message we're going to provide, and there's somebody who's going to listen to it, and then it's going to have some kind of outcome. So the source actually is the social engineer person. So you or I, as a social engineer, we might use email as the method, and the message might be trying to get somebody to provide when they're going to be in town, and the person receiving the message is the receiver, and the desired feedback is that the person would give us their vacation schedule. So one thing to keep in mind here is it might be useful actually to start out with what is it you're wanting to get back. So the feedback in this case is the vacation schedule of the receiver, and work your way backward. If you want the vacation schedule of the receiver, so the message has to really play to the emotions of why do we need the vacation schedule? Well, we need the vacation schedule because we are spoofing as the manager. We want to make sure that we have coverage. And we're going to use email, so we know that we have to get the spoof and email address, and the source is obviously the social engineer. So understanding that communication is so critical in this process, there is the concept of elicitation. And this is a great word. And it's really to elicit information from somebody means to draw them out, to get them to do what you want them to do, to take a course of action that you wish without telling them. So it's an indirect suggestion. It's often a subtle extraction. There is a quote from the book that says something to the effect that the security agencies call it a subtle extraction of information during conversation. And I'm sure we've all met people who are really good at it. And one of the key things is that they have the ability to listen. And that is probably the most important thing. So as a social engineer, you have to identify what it is you're hoping to obtain, because you sort of set an environment to be able to do that. So for example, if you are desiring somebody to change a behavior, let's say you're desiring that they shop at a different store, all right? Let's pretend this is a commercial advertising thing. Your goal is to get them to start shopping at Trader Joe's as opposed to Safeway. So that's the goal. So you set the stage by doing certain things. Like, so maybe you set the stage by saying, organic and healthy, and really giving people information about something they will agree upon right away. Get agreement that, you want to be healthy because being healthy helps us to live longer. And we know that eating the right foods helps us to be healthy. So in eating the right foods, we want to make sure that we're eating fruits and vegetables, and that we're eating foods that are not loaded with chemicals and are not loaded with all kind of toxins and pesticides. So you set this stage, you start to create this level of agreement, and we call that preloading. And as you do that, as I'm talking, like, you want to make sure that you're getting foods that are going to be healthy, and you want to make sure your family is getting that too. Milk that has not been treated by any kind of hormone is better for babies, the research shows, because it doesn't have the baby start to accumulate this hormone within their own body. So you as a parent already, oh my gosh, well, I want to make sure my baby is safe. I'm going to get milk that doesn't have that hormone. And we start to get this level of agreement. And then we come to, Trader Joe's is a really great store because it has organic, and it has natural fruits, and it has, organic milk. It's got a reasonable price. It's kind of a hip place to go. And the idea is to let your target start to come to that place that, yes, I want healthy food. Yes, I want organic. Yes, it sounds like Trader Joe's is going to have everything I want. That concept is called preloading, setting the stage. And mastering elicitation, what you're really doing is you're building a relationship. And I'm sure you've all met people who are just superb at building a relationship. It's about being a listener. And being a listener means putting your own ego aside to be able to really hear what the other person is saying. Often a really great method to be able to get this coherence of thought on the same page is to repeat what the person has said to you. So for example, if they say, I really worry about my children walking to school when it is still so dark, so I want to change the time that school opens. And what you could say, so you've heard that concern, and what you could echo back is, yeah, I hear that you're saying that walking to school in the dark is a little challenging, or It gives you concern. Just repeating what the other person says automatically brings you to a place where you're starting to build a relationship. Um, to master elicitation, you have to not be afraid to talk to people. You have to be willing to just, you know, go out there and talk to people you don't know. And it might be finding something that that person is doing or saying that will give you a connection, creating some kind of a connection, and then showing some type of a concern. One of the things that you want to consider, though, is don't offer advice. A, if advice isn't being asked for, or B, if you're not confident that the advice you would give is correct. If somebody tells you about some situation, like the CFO tells you, one of the biggest concerns I have is that my IT department doesn't have enough duplication of skills within the department. So if my network engineer leaves, I'm really concerned that I won't have that skill set to be able to pick it up. And one of the ways to be able to connect, for example, with that question would be to say, yeah, I know many other customers, or I know many other people in your same situation. And it seems that what they've done is they've actually hired a consulting firm to come in and kind of be that back end. So just in case you should lose some mission critical staff, you're able to just fill it in with a consultant who's already familiar with your configuration. Thinking of ways to be able to connect with the person is very important, and not being judgmental, listening and just not making any kind of assumptions. This is key to getting information, building relationships. So some tips that you want to consider on this building relationships is you've got to appeal to the target's ego, even if you don't want to, even if they're a windbag. You just have to kind of listen and kind of nod your head as if you're, if you're agreeing, even if you don't want to, because the goal is to find some mutual interest that will then bring you to this connection. Getting to this connection where you and the target have some type of mutual interest is the most effective way to be able to build this relationship. You can make a false statement, but you got to be careful about that. You want to make sure that if you make a false statement, you might want to couch it in terms of, I thought I heard that you just launched a new product in December, and then the person you're talking with, if the person is in charge of product launch, might say, no, actually, we're going to launch it in January. It got a little delayed, but we put in some new features and functions, and when we launch it, we're going to be partnering with Google, and all of a sudden you've gotten more information. And the other thing is volunteer information, because there's this concept of obligation that if you give some information, then there's this quid pro quo that they'll feel a bit of a sense of obligation to give information. Now, that doesn't always work. And you as a social engineer might have these tips, but people at high-end jobs now are being trained these exact same tips. And they might just listen and nod their head. And I've had that happen as well. Okay, so another method, which I do not encourage, is drugs and alcohol. Mostly you're at a cocktail party and you've brought somebody's at the cocktail party who can give you information that you need. The more alcohol you give them, the more loose their tongue becomes. And actually there's an example about a group of nuclear scientists, a specific nuclear scientist who went to China in the 1980s. And what happened is the Chinese were toasting him, and every time they toasted him, he would drink, and they kept trying to get information about how this nuclear reactor worked. And he didn't really say how it worked, but he did say, well, when two balls fall off a table, something happens with the speed and they're not able to keep up. And because of that, there is a reaction. That tiny bit of information was enough to help the Chinese move forward. And I put in the Canvas this week a talk, no, a document that talks about this very nuclear scientist and Chinese breach. Okay, so lastly, we look at question types when you're talking with people. Now, open-ended questions, those are the questions that when I was a reporter back in the days, it was, who, what, where, when, and why, and how. Who, what, when, where, how, 5 questions. And that would require people to do more than just give you a yes or no or uh-huh or nod kind of answer. Those kind of answers are only good unless you're trying to confirm a piece of information. One way that you want to use those, though, is, start with a narrow question and then go to a broad question. So, for example, how are things at the agency, for example, would be too broad. But if you were to ask a question like, how are things within the information services network part of the agency, that's very specific. We start to get into very specific things and we can move forward. Closed-ended questions, like I said, is really about just confirming or disaffirming information. Leading questions, like we've all heard about leading questions where, we've all watched enough TV shows where there's lawyers and they say, tell us about that time that you were with Dr. Jones on March 15th. It's already kind of assuming that you're there. They start with some fact and then the person has to agree like, hey, I wasn't with Dr. Jones. One of the things about leading questions is that's becoming more and more apparent is leading questions can change memory. So, for example, I am a practitioner of neuro-linguistic programming. And in neuro-linguistic programming, the whole concept is that we have these neural pathways, and certain words, we can change the way these pathways are going to shift. And one of the things that is really apparent is, let's say there's an accident, and the police are asking the people about the accident. So the guy who had one of the witnesses says, yeah, I saw a car and a white car, and it was moving fast and it hit the pedestrian. And then the policeman says, so you saw the white car and it didn't stop at the stop sign and it hit the pedestrian. Now, the guy never said it didn't stop at the stop sign. But then the next thing that the witness says is, yeah, you're right. The car didn't stop at the stop sign. And you're not even sure if there was a stop sign. But you've planted information into that memory that now that person thinks that there was a stop sign that the guy didn't stop at. So you start with some fact, but you can create a whole scenario. And it's dangerous. So you have to be careful about that as a social engineer so you don't create the information. You want the target to create the information. And assumptive questions, you have to have some ideas of the fact. Like, I assume that you're not going to lay off any people now that you have this profit. You have an idea that there's profit. You're assuming that you're making that in a statement. But never give all the facts. Because once you do that, you've given all your power away. So those are the 4 types of questions that we use as a social engineer. So these are some free resources you might want to look at to help us really understand more about social engineering and how we can get information from others. And this is the end. Thank you very much. Happy elicitation to you.